Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this very short session. I want to talk about one of my latest books, but in particular, I want to talk about this concept of the proactive paradox. And I sure, like many of you, I've been frustrated with people that I work with who perhaps don't show the necessary initiative that they should do. So, independent judgment and being autonomous and making those decisions without checking with me. And so I got curious about that and wondered why people just find it so difficult to be autonomous and show independent judgment. So that's really what I want to talk about in our brief time together today. So I'll just share my slides and then we'll launch into the presentation. So just a little bit about me, because some of you, you may have heard of me, but you may not know much about me. But you can see that obviously I do platform speaking. I, also run workshops. I write books. I'm up to my 13th book at the moment. I also am an executive coach. And I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, which is a little sad at my age. But we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks to recover at my age. But never mind, that's a little bit about me. Let's launch into the topic. I think the obvious question that I've posed here is, how do we get our team members to display more initiative and independent judgment? I mean, at the end of the day, that's a big issue for lots and lots of managers. Now, during COVID, of course, when people are working in isolation, people probably had to exercise independent judgment because they couldn't just walk over to their manager's office and ask. So we probably saw a little bit more of that during COVID, but still, I think a lot of people are plagued by this. And I want to talk about it and just dismantle it a little bit, and then perhaps talk about 4 different strategies to do this. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording, incidentally, at the end of this, so you'll receive that sometime today. Now, I'll cover 3 things in our short time together. I want to talk, obviously, about what this proactive paradox is. So what does it actually mean? And I'll sort of give you a little bit of an overview of that. It's not a particularly complex topic, but it's one that I'm sure many of you will be aware of. Once I've done that, I'd like to talk about the 4 strategies for breaking this paradox. So how do we actually get people to use their independent judgment and get them to show more initiative? Now, of course, we can go too far with that too. Obviously, you don't want people just going off and doing their own thing when there's a clear train track or process to work with. But probably what's more an issue is getting people to actually demonstrate that. And I've got a special offer at the end of this presentation for you. All right, so let's launch into a paradox. The concept, of course, we use the word paradox a lot, and I like to talk about the concept of the chicken and the egg. What comes first? Is it the chicken or is it the egg? And often a paradox can be what actually starts this process? Where does it begin? And so the proactive paradox is no different in that regard. So let me now share with you what the proactive paradox is. Now, you can see this very simple diagram over here on the left-hand side, and I'll just explain it to you, and you can sort of see how it works. So normally when a leader inherits a team, they're usually on the same page as the team members. So, for example, if you were inheriting a new team, a group of people who've never worked with before, you may expect them to demonstrate their initiative at the right place at the right time in the right way. You want people to back themselves. You want them to use their judgment in the right place. That's your expectation. I must say, not all managers want that, but I think most of us have an intent that that's what we're after. Now, interesting enough, the people that you're actually leading, and I'd say most, not all, but most of them probably want to act autonomously as well. They don't want to keep coming to you every time they have to make a decision. So therefore, they're quite comfortable with making their own independent judgment. So really, at the beginning of a relationship that you've got with a team, you're all on the same page. So you want people to show initiative and they want to show initiative. Now, what happens? Something curious happens somewhere along the line, because the next rung there is that you as a leader might be noticing that there's not as much independent judgment as you would like. So what happens is you have a team meeting and you sit in the team meeting and you explain to everybody that you'd like them to show independent judgment. You make some blanket statements about that, and that you're very happy for people to back themselves in the right circumstances. So that's the comment that you make to your team members. Now, all of your team members are sitting there in the meeting, probably metaphorically sitting on their hands. So what they're doing is they're sitting there thinking to themselves, I'm not convinced that my boss actually wants me to show independent judgment, because I've observed previously that he or she might have done this or that, and I'm not convinced that they really mean that. So they're a bit skeptical at this point. So what happens in the third rung is that you as the leader, having made this announcement at the team meeting, have noticed that everybody doesn't seem to be jumping in and showing autonomy and initiative. And of course, you're going to get frustrated with that because you've made an announcement. It's your expectation that people will back themselves. And because of the fact that nobody is stepping into the arena, you decide to jump in and fill the gap. So what you do is you start doing some of the things that need to be done, which, your expectation is other people will do it, but because they're not doing it, you're jumping in. Now, while you're doing this, this is where it gets interesting. Everybody notices you jumping into the arena. Everybody notices you filling this vacuum, and they assume, of course, that they were correct in their assumption earlier on that really it wasn't appropriate for you, that is, the team leader, the team member, to show their independent judgment. So that's how the paradox works. So in other words, everyone's on the same page, and everybody ends up being frustrated because the leader's frustrated with the team members because they're not showing independent judgment. And of course, the team members are frustrated with the leader because the leader isn't allowing them, or at least their perception is not allowing them to show their independent judgment. So ultimately, there are three steps or three aspects of this, three stages, if you like. The first stage is there's total agreement. And that is that you want people to show independent judgment and they want to show independent judgment. So everybody's on the same page to start with. And then there's a degree of skepticism because people have seen that perhaps you might be meddling in a few issues that people think are really their issues to sort out. You make an announcement that you want people to back themselves and to be autonomous. But because of this skepticism, nobody does anything. And then what happens, of course, is that you jump in and you actually have to micromanage because otherwise the job doesn't get done. And what that does is it confirms in the minds of the team members that you weren't really serious about, people showing their autonomy. So that's how it actually works. Now, you might say, well, why does this happen? Well, it's often a communication issue more than anything else. I mean, for example, if somebody comes to you and wants a quick answer to a problem and you're thinking in your head, you should be able to answer that, but because they're there and you think it's very quick, you give them the answer. So the assumption there, of course, is that every time I've got a simple question to ask, I go straight to my boss. And of course, all that does is encourage them to keep coming back to you about very simple things that they should be able to resolve. So these are small moments that occur in the day-to-day running of any business. And, often these things send very clear signals to people about what's appropriate and what's not in terms of showing independent judgment. Now, there are actually 4 ways of overcoming this. And of course, I go into this in great detail in my book. But if what I want to do now is share with you what these 4 particular strategies are. And I'm not suggesting that you need to use all 4. But if plan A doesn't work, of course, you can try a plan B. It also depends very much on the organization as well that you're working in. Because if you're working in a very hierarchical organization, a very rules-bound organization, a very regulatory environment, then some of these things are not going to be applicable because of the very nature of the culture of the workplace. So there's a whole lot of variables. And of course, there's your own personal style as well as a leader. Your style will dictate that you'll feel more comfortable with some of these strategies than others. So what we'll do now is we're going to have a look at each of these strategies. So we've got shared purpose, boundary management, information exchange, and proactive accountability. So let's actually have a look at my model and how that works. The first thing I want to say about the proactive framework is that you'll notice up the top there's 2, there's a typical 2x2 matrix, but you've got stimulating proactivity and regulating proactivity. So the 2 strategies on the left-hand side, that is shared purpose and information exchange, is really about stimulating proactivity. That's getting people to show their initiative. Now, I've been talking about that for the majority of the time so far, but then also I think it's important that people understand that there are certain places they can show initiative and there are other places they can't. And that's where the middle column, which is the regulating proactivity, comes in. So boundary management and proactive accountability are about actually regulating it. So in other words, it's not saying we don't want you to show initiative. It's just more so that we want you to show it in this area and not in that area. And then over on the right-hand side, you'll notice that the top 2, which is shared purpose and boundary management, is a manager-initiated strategy. So the manager is actually the one that does or initiates that. Whereas information exchange and proactive accountability are employee initiated. So the employee is the one that is expected to initiate those 2 strategies. So what I'd like to do now is just have a look at these 4. And while I'm sharing these 4 strategies with you, I'd like you to have a think about your own experience, what you feel most comfortable with, which would very much depend on the nature of the work that you're involved in, but also the culture that you're working in as well, and what you think is applicable in the culture that you're working in. And I guess the third variable is the people you lead. If you're leading people who are very competent, who have great experience and knowledge, then of course, that's a different style of leadership, isn't it? And of course, if you've got people who have limited knowledge and experience, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. So you put all of those 3 together, can determine which of these 4 you might use. So let's have a look. So the first one I'll share with you is the concept of shared purpose. Now, shared purpose is really aligning the needs and interests of the organization and the individual. That sounds quite simple. And of course, people talk about it all the time. It's not that simple, actually. This alignment promises to stimulate enterprising behavior to achieve a clear purpose. Now, the simplest way of doing this would be through walking the talk. So if you as a leader are doing certain things that are very much in line with what you expect other people to do, then that's a good start in the right direction. But shared purpose is getting everybody on the same page. So, for example, that might mean that you'd sit down with your team and work out what the purpose of the team is. And, you'd spend a lot of time and energy getting the clarity of purpose so that people can feel confident that if I back myself and show independent judgment, then I'm doing this for a very clear reason. In other words, it's aligned with our purpose. So they feel a little bit more comfortable to be able to back themselves because they know the end result will actually be in alignment with the organization's purpose or the team's purpose. So getting people on the same page is not as easy as we might think, but it does require a lot of time, effort, and energy. I'm sure you realize that it's not just a simple case of you putting together a few words and saying this is our purpose statement and just hoping it all works. That doesn't actually achieve too much except a lot of frustration. So you really have to work with people moment by moment, project by project, incident by incident, and to be able to align people's purpose to the purpose of the organization. So that's obviously one strategy. And the reason why that would work, of course, is it gives people the confidence to know that if I do show my independent judgment, it is for a good reason. And I can justify that later on if I'm challenged, because at the end of it, by showing independent purpose, I'm going to help achieve the purpose of the team or whatever. So that's one approach you can use. Now, obviously, if you're a leader who has a very democratic style of leadership, then it would be very suited to that approach. So let's look at the second one now. Now, boundary management, you might recall on the previous model or framework that I showed you, boundary management by its nature is actually articulating very carefully where it's appropriate to show initiative and where it's not. So it involves careful communication of the kinds of initiative that you desire and where it shouldn't be displayed. So in other words, in this area, it's perfectly appropriate for you to show initiative, but in this area over here, we want you to follow the process, the regulations, whatever it might be. And this, of course, gives people a sense of psychological safety, because if we know where the pockets of showing initiative are in work, then of course we can feel comfortable doing that because we know that that's an area where initiative is expected. But on the other hand, if this is an area that frankly has to follow processes, procedures, and systems, then independent judgment is not going to be accepted in those circumstances. So, for example, in a health and safety issue, you would expect, of course, that people would follow processes, procedures. All right, that's what the processes and the procedures are there for. You don't want people to just go off and do whatever they want. Or if you're working in a regulatory environment, you want people to follow a paper trail or a process. So that would be an area where clearly you would not show independent judgment. But if you're dealing with a customer and that customer has got a very unusual kind of request, you may be, through boundary management, it might be explained to you that you can definitely show independent judgment in trying to deal with that issue, because we expect that you be very flexible with our customers. So this one is very good for a workplace where there's some really clear areas where initiative is going to be very effective, and on the other hand, where initiative should not be shown. Now, information exchange is a process where there's, the communication channels are open between the manager and the employee. So the manager and the employee work very collaboratively together. And so you might say, but surely haven't we just covered that when we talked about shared purpose? Not necessarily. This is about a clear exchange. So you would find in this case, there would be lots of conversations between the team leader and team members. There'd be regular catch-ups. There would be regular exchange of ideas in team meetings. And ultimately, through that exchange of ideas and communication, what actually happens is that the manager understands the perspectives of their team members. They may not always agree, but they understand but also the team members understand the leader and they know what's expected of them as well. So everybody's got a sense of psychological safety because they know exactly where everybody stands on issues. So therefore, the individual may feel comfortable exercising prudent initiative because they know that that would be acceptable because they've got a good, robust working relationship with their manager or their team leader. And so that creates a safe environment to be able to back yourself and to make those judgments and decisions. A good example of that would be if your team, remember before COVID, people used to go away on these retreats. I really enjoyed those retreats when I was asked to come and facilitate those strategic planning sessions. They were a lot of fun. And what would happen is that people would be expected to share their information and ideas. And ultimately, the idea of the retreat was for the team to be able to walk away and be on the same page as their manager. And the reason that that worked so effectively, when it did work effectively, is because there was an exchange of information that everybody was expected to contribute, and the manager, of course, wanted everyone to contribute as well. So that worked, and that works quite well. So information exchange is a process where, the power relationship between managers and individuals is far less. So again, it would depend on your style of leadership. It will also depend on what you're trying to do. Now, the final one is probably the most interesting one of all, and that is proactive accountability. What does that mean? Well, proactive accountability means you can let your employees exercise their independent judgment, but the catch is they will take all the risk. So in other words, if an individual does show initiative, then we will accept that, provided, of course, it works out well. Now, if it doesn't work out well, of course, it's going to be on that employee who showed initiative. So you might think, well, that sounds a little negative. It doesn't sound like it's encouraging a lot of independent judgment. Well, there are certain circumstances where that would be extremely important. Now, I'm thinking of perhaps a government department that's really very rule-bound and very regulatory, or perhaps a military organization. Now, in those sorts of circumstances, you do want people to show initiative, but of course, you don't want them to be showing initiative all the time, because those sorts of organizations are based on rules and regulations. So, for example, if there's unethical behavior that's happening in your organization and you're quite a regulatory environment, there probably should be an expectation that if somebody does witness unethical behavior, that they would be comfortable enough to show the initiative to, call out that behavior by going to the authority or whatever it is, or the system that you've got operating. Of course, a lot of people don't do that, and they don't do that for good reason, because they often find that regardless of whether it was unethical behavior or not, the person is often ostracized because of that. But in regulatory environments, you still want people to be proactive, but you want it to be done in the right place and the right time. All right, so those things are critically important. Another example would be in a crisis or an emergency. Now, in a crisis or an emergency, you don't want people just to be following rules and regulations, because in a crisis, which is unique to that circumstance, something that's perhaps never happened before, you want people to show a little bit of proactivity, because obviously a crisis is a unique circumstance and you expect people to show that. So this is the most difficult of the four strategies to promote. And I think a lot of that, the reason for that is that because you wouldn't use it in all sorts of situations. As I said before, if you're working in a government department, you would expect people you would understand that this would be quite a useful strategy to use in those circumstances. But if it was a startup IT firm, it's probably not ideal. You actually would probably use shared purpose or information exchange as a far better strategy. So you can see that you've got 4 different strategies now to be able to work towards. Okay, so folks, hopefully that's just given you some clarity around the concept of what the proactive paradox is and how you might actually break that paradox by using those 4 strategies. And, you know, and as I said before, if one strategy doesn't work, you try another strategy. And ultimately what happens is that as a manager and a leader, you're using a variety of leadership approaches. So it's a framework to help you to be able to move towards creating an environment where people are comfortable and feel safe being autonomous and sharing their own independent judgment. Okay, now, before I finish up, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I have another book coming out later this year, published in the United States, which I'm very excited about. It's called The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential. And what I'm looking at there is the employee life cycle. So, you know, there's at the first stage, there's recruitment and selection, and then there's induction. And then, of course, there's the development, and then there's a rewarding, and then there is the succession planning. All of these are familiar with everybody, but I've used each of those different stages of the employee life cycle to really challenge conventional wisdom around the way we get the best out of people. Because as we know, 70% of people are disengaged at work. We really have to try some new things. So if you'd like to join me on the 4th of March, which of course is next Friday, I have one of these every Friday, I will run through the big HR shifts for the future. So I'll talk about the different shifts that are necessary. I won't go obviously into them in great depth, but you can at least get a sense of what they are. And if you're interested, you just have to click on that link there, because I'll be sending you the slides, and just register as you did for today. So that's for next Friday. And finally, if you would like to pre-order a copy of The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential, it'll be out in approximately May and June. We haven't got an exact date at this stage. All you need to do is to send me an email, and I'll put you on the list. And the moment that book is hot off the press, I'll send you a copy. I'll obviously send you an invoice as well, and you'll get it at a reduced price. So all you've got to do is send me an email, and I will put you on a list. All right, so folks, that's about it for me. I don't think there's anything else at this stage. Look forward to catching up with you next week. As I said before, as a leader, try different approaches. And when you're faced with that issue of how do I get my people to show more initiative, have a think for a minute. Well, why is it that they're not showing initiative? What's the threat there? Because obviously there is a threat, because that's why they're not doing that. And then try to use some of those different approaches. So folks, thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we can catch up next Friday. Thanks everyone. All the best, and goodbye.